Hey guys, tonight we drift through silk curtains into a throne room where power tastes like honey and betrayal smells faintly of lotus oil. You're not standing in some dusty museum or thumbing through dry textbooks. No, you're on the deck of Cleopatra's golden barge, gliding silently down the Cydnus River under a sky so rich and purple it looks stolen from a Renaissance painting. The water glows with torchlight. The air is heavy with cinnamon and wine, and you are close enough to see the glint of gold leaf on Cleopatra's skin. She isn't just arriving to meet Mark Antony. She's making her entrance like a living deity. Perfumed sails billow like breath. Silver oars row in time with music you feel more than hear. And Cleopatra? She lounges beneath a canopy dressed as Aphrodite, blinking slowly like a cat who knows exactly how dangerous her softness is. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the moment as Antony does, half in awe, half already undressed in his imagination. This isn't just flirting, it's theater, it's propaganda. It's Cleopatra doing what she does best, weaponizing desire. And unlike the shriveled old senators back in Rome, you're not scoffing. You're caught. She knows you're watching. And she likes it. But here's the thing nobody warns you about. Cleopatra's diplomacy wasn't some coy game of fan flicks and shy glances. It was a blood-soaked chess match played in linen sheets, banquet halls, and yes, on the battlefield. Forget the Hollywood fantasy. You're not here for pouting and eyeliner. You're here for the woman who restructured empires between rounds of erotic diplomacy. Cleopatra didn't seduce great men. She made them vulnerable. You see, back when she met Julius Caesar, she didn't slink in through a garden gate. She had herself smuggled into his palace inside a rug. Unrolled like a precious artifact, she stood up, smooth as honey in the Egyptian sun, and said something that probably translated to, "So, what's for dinner?" He was 52, balding, and married. She was 21, multilingual, and already terrifyingly good at reading men. And yet, he couldn't resist. Their nights weren't just romantic escapades, they were full-on negotiations. Between kisses, they redrew maps. While he admired her jewelry, she slipped in a request for troops. And historians still argue whether Cleopatra loved Caesar, or simply loved what he could offer: a throne reclaimed, a dynasty secured, a future bent to her will. Either way, 9 months later, she had a royal baby on her hip and political leverage. In Rome's Senate, sex with Cleopatra was not just physical, it was infrastructural. Like the story Eleanor, Herman tells of one medieval queen who would only grant her husband's requests if he visited her chambers first. Same energy, but Cleopatra was subtler. She'd make you fall in love with a version of the world where she always ended up on top. And then she'd build that world while you were still catching your breath. And speaking of breathless, let's return to that golden barge. Mark Antony is already spiraling. This is the man who threw wild parties, drank his generals under the table, and supposedly slept with half of Asia Minor, yet here he is. Dumbstruck, Cleopatra had read the brief. Antony was obsessed with Dionysus, the god of wine, pleasure, madness. So naturally, she floated into his life dressed as the man's favorite deity. She didn't seduce him. She ensnared him in a custom-tailored fantasy. A woman who could not only match his decadence, but outperform it. Her entire presentation whispered, "You think you're wild? I was born in it. I curate chaos." You don't recover from that kind of performance. Antony certainly didn single quotes T. As the boat docks and the music softens, Cleopatra steps ashore, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, maybe even a superior. She's not here to plead for alliances. She's here to confirm that Antony has passed her. Audition. The breeze lifts her veil just enough to show the curve of her jaw, the shimmer of her earrings, the cool calculation in her eyes. One wrong move and she vanished like smoke, leaving only the perfume behind. And that's the erotic riddle of Cleopatra. She was at once goddess in gamble, softness, and statecraft. You never quite knew if she loved you or just loved what you represented. For Caesar, she was a partner in empire. For Antony, she became the center of gravity. And for both, she was the undoing dot. Oh, and remember that fringe tidbit. Ancient Egyptians believed that mixing crocodile dung with fermented honey made the perfect contraceptive paste. Cleopatra's court had whole recipes for this stuff, stored right next to the scrolls of political treaties. Sexy and pragmatic. Anyway, here you are now, caught in Cleopatra's story like a silk robe snagged on a jeweled bedpost. You think you're just watching history unfold, but let's be honest, you've already been seduced. You arrive in Alexandria. Just as the dusk thickens into velvet, the city doesn't sleep. It lounges. Golden light spills from doorways carved into sandstone. Laughter drips from balconies, and the whole place smells like cardamom and roasted goat. You're not walking through a city, you're being swallowed by it, slowly, like a fig melting on the tongue. Cleopatra's Alexandria isn't Rome's Grimstone or Athens' dry wisdom. This is a city where libraries keep erotica shelved, beside astronomy, where gods walk disguised as dancers, and where power slips into bed wearing silk and good cologne. You follow the pulse of the place toward the palace, past mosaic courtyards and fountains shaped like lions' mouths, past eunuchs with clipboards and priests balancing sacred cats. Inside, it's marble overkill, emeralds embedded in pillars, ceilings that mimic the heavens. One hallway smells of roses, another of sandalwood, another strangely of the sea, though it's hundreds of steps from the harbor. Every detail is curated, every corridor a seduction. You're already half drunk, and you haven't touched wine. You finally reach the private wing, if anything in Cleopatra's world can be called private. The queen is nowhere to be seen, but you feel her presence like a weight in the air. This is where she hosted Caesar. This is where she entertained Antony. And this is where the real diplomacy happened, not in courtrooms, but across candlelit tables and beneath imported linen canopies. Cleopatra's lovers didn't just enter a palace, they entered a performance. Historians still argue whether Alexandria's court was modeled more on Egyptian grandeur or Hellenistic theatrics. But either way, it worked. Cleopatra knew how to blur the lines. She combined the sacred rites of Isis with the flair of Greek symposiums. One night she'd appear in golden robes, blessing the feast like a living goddess. The next she'd dress down in simple linen and quote Homer between sips of fermented pomegranate. And yet, her bedroom remained the most politically charged chamber in the city. Let's pause for a sex story. Not Cleopatra this time. Let's rewind to King Henry II of France and his mistress Diane de Poitiers. According to Eleanor Herman, Diane kept herself youthful by bathing in gold-infused water and sleeping with Henry nightly to absorb his strength. Cleopatra would have appreciated the tactic. She wasn't just about pleasure, she was about extraction. Every lover was a resource, every embrace a transaction cloaked in perfume and candlelight. And Antony? Poor, swaggering Antony? He never stood a chance. He loved spectacle. So Cleopatra gave him one. Banquets with jeweled fish, wines chilled with mountain snow, pearls dissolved in vinegar just to prove a point. On one occasion, Cleopatra bet Antony she could throw the most expensive dinner in history. The next night, she plucked a giant pearl from her earring, crushed it in acid and drank it. That's not flirting. That's economic flexing on a mythological level. But beneath all that excess, under the layers of gold leaf and mythology, there was strategy. Alexandria was a city built for optics. Cleopatra's court wasn't just decadent, it was designed to feel like another world. A place where Roman rules dissolved, where the queen could remind you that while Rome claimed dominion, she embodied divinity. And when a man sleeps beside a goddess, he tends to forget his Senate obligations. Still, you can't help but notice the fringe, the oddballs of Cleopatra's entourage. There's a dwarf who serves as her food taster, a eunuch who composes songs that are really coded reports, a concubine who's also a trained assassin. This isn't just a harem, it's a soft coup wearing mascara. You get the sense that if Cleopatra snaps her fingers, 100 secrets unravel at once. And then finally she appears. Not announced, not trumpeted. Just there suddenly, leaning in a doorway, dressed in a robe the color of wet copper. Her voice is soft, but it carries. Her eyes scan the room like a general checking the lines. And when she laughs, even the marble sighs. You understand now. Alexandria isn't her capital. It's her body, extended outward. The city breathes when she does. She pours you wine herself. Not because she has to, but because the gesture is loaded. In Egypt, the act of sharing wine from your own hands was intimate, nearly sacred. And Cleopatra always knew when to break protocol for effect. You sip, unsure if this is foreplay or forewarning. Probably both. As the night thickens, music swells from somewhere unseen. You think of the Roman embassy squirming in their wool togas. Back home, issuing statements about Eastern decadence and corruption of values. But you're starting to suspect that what they really feared wasn't corruption. It was competition. Rome couldn't compete with a queen who made sin look sacred. And so you recline. Like they once did, the wine making you slower, softer. Alexandria wraps itself around you, and in that moment, you understand Antony's fall. It wasn't love, it was relief. A place where the world stopped demanding performance and simply asked for presence. Of course, he stayed. By now, you've probably realized Cleopatra didn't play the game of power like anyone else. She rewrote the rules in coal and kissed them onto scrolls. Sex, in her hands, wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. It wasn't about attraction, it was about alignment. And if you're thinking she simply used her body to get what she wanted, that's the lazy version. What she really did was far more dangerous. She used intimacy as diplomacy. Every caress was a clause. Every glance, a negotiation. She didn't just sleep with powerful men. She made them feel chosen, seen, necessary to something divine. Let's go back to Caesar for a moment. Julius Caesar, the man who crossed the Rubicon, who conquered Gaul, who crushed Pompey. The same Caesar who walked into Alexandria and found himself entangled quite literally in Cleopatra's linen. That first night, after being unrolled from the rug, she didn't just flash a smile and hope for mercy. She spun a narrative that she was Egypt, that her exile had been a wound to the goddess Isis herself, that she and Caesar, together, could restore balance to a world spinning off its axis. Historians still argue whether he believed her or simply found her entertaining, but the result was the same. By dawn, she was back on the throne, and he? Well, Caesar stayed in Alexandria for nearly a year. That's not a fling, that's an occupation. While Rome was boiling over with debt, fire, and political enemies, he lingered in Cleopatra's palace like a student on extended spring break. The two even toured the Nile together in what can only be described as an erotic imperial field trip. Scholars speculate what they talked about: astronomy, poetry, agricultural subsidies. But what matters is that when he sailed back to Rome, he left her with a child and an ironclad alliance. Sex had done what treaties couldn't. Of course, Rome didn't take kindly to this. Cleopatra wasn't some demure concubine waiting in the wings. She arrived in Rome with her child, set up residence across the Tiber, and paraded through town in full Egyptian regalia. The senators were livid. Here was a foreign queen, unwed, unapologetic, and politically effective. She didn't sneak, she shined. And worse, she made Caesar more monarch than magistrate. He started wearing purple robes, demanded divine honors, and began constructing temples in his name. You see where this is going. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In ancient Rome, public toilets had no partitions. Senators would sit side by side, debating politics and bowel movements like it was just another Tuesday. Imagine that, while Cleopatra was building palaces and slipping poison into cups, Roman lawmakers were conducting vote tallies mid-squat. Somehow she made all of them look like amateurs. And then came the Ides of March. Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor, his blood soaking the base of Pompey's statue. Cleopatra didn't wait to be next. She packed up her son, Caesarion, her living insurance policy, and sailed back to Alexandria. Her gamble had paid off in some ways, but Rome remained a jungle of knives. Still, she hadn't lost. Because what Cleopatra had mastered wasn't seduction, it was resonance. She made sure every man who left her chambers carried a version of her in his chest. Not just the lover, but the idea that power could be tender, that divinity could be tactile. That maybe, just maybe, the world needed a queen. And if that idea terrified Rome, good. It meant it was working. And now, back in Alexandria, she waited. Not passively, never that. She tightened her alliances, trained her navy, and watched from her throne while Rome fell into chaos. Brutus and Cassius were raising armies. Octavian was nursing grudges. And Mark Antony? He was on the cusp of becoming the most important man in the world. Cleopatra's next move would be the boldest yet, not just seducing a man, but shaping the very identity of empire. But we're not there yet. First, you need to understand just how much Cleopatra had already shifted the map. She had transformed the very currency of diplomacy. Where others traded gold, she offered moments. Where others threatened, she invited. And unlike the men of her time, she knew the real battlefield was the human psyche. That behind every army, every edict, every coin pressed with a ruler's face, there was a single, naked truth. People follow the ones who make them feel something. That's the root of erotic diplomacy. Not just sex, but sensation. A well-timed look. A whispered promise. A shared cup of honeyed wine. Cleopatra weaponized presence. And while Rome flailed, she waited serpent still, scented, and certain that history would find her irresistible. You wake to the sound of laughter drifting through a colonnade soaked in morning light, and the first thing you feel is disorientation, because you're not in Rome anymore. You're in the middle of a romance so meticulously constructed it might as well be a war plan. Mark Antony has arrived in Alexandria, and Cleopatra is about to test whether lightning can strike twice. But this time, it's not about reclaiming a throne. It's about rewriting the balance of power across two continents. And as you peel back the silks of this scene, you realize something chilling beneath the perfume and poetry. Antony's story isn't going to end well. Here's the hook. Imagine the most charismatic man of the Roman world, striding into Egypt, expecting gratitude, expecting submission, and instead, he walks into a party where he's not the center. Cleopatra doesn't run to greet him. She doesn't even rise. She makes him wait on purpose. She knows men like Antony are addicted to momentum. Pause them long enough, and they'll unravel. When she finally does appear, it's with a smile that says, "I've already won." And she had. Antony arrived with an agenda, a fleet, and a fresh list of demands. He'd come to summon Cleopatra to Rome's side in the brewing civil war. But within days, he was sharing feasts with her, slurring his Latin, speaking Greek like a schoolboy, and announcing to his advisors that he'd be delaying departure for a bit. A bit became a season became a year. That year became a legend. You trail them through the palace grounds now, through ivy-wrapped gardens where parrots echo dirty jokes told in two languages. They're playing a game Cleopatra invented called the Inseparables. Every day, they must eat together, bathe together, sleep side by side, and make decisions as one. It's sweet, it's ridiculous. It's also a psychological chokehold. Antony doesn't realize it yet, but he's being tethered subtly, sensually to a political machine disguised as a love affair. And here's the sex story you didn't ask for but now can't forget. According to Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History lovers in elite Hellenistic courts believed that consuming your partner's sweat, yes, literal sweat, could bind their soul to yours. Cleopatra's bath attendants were said to collect Antony's linens after lovemaking and mix his perspiration into her lotions. Myth? Maybe. But Cleopatra never missed a chance to make love symbolic. She knew the body was a language, and Antony? He was fluent in hers. Historians still argue whether Antony loved Cleopatra for who she was or for what she represented. Was it lust? Love? Political desperation? The answer is tangled. What we do know is this: within months of meeting her, Antony abandoned his Roman wife, gave Cleopatra territory once governed by Caesar, and paraded through Alexandria dressed as Dionysus to her Isis. And not just once, repeatedly. The Roman world watched in horror. Antony, the general who once disciplined his legions with iron, was now dancing in silken robes, judging wine competitions, and naming his children things like Helios and Selene. He hosted symposiums where philosophers debated pleasure and strategy. Between courses of peacock tongues and jewel-stuffed figs, he'd gone native, they said. He'd been bewitched. What they couldn't admit was this: Cleopatra had exposed how brittle Roman masculinity really was. Rome had rules. Cleopatra had rituals. And in her ritual, sex and sovereignty were braided tightly together. To make love to Cleopatra was to be inducted into a theology of power. She didn't just worship Isis, she became her. Their union was more than erotic. It was cosmic. Antony wasn't just sleeping with a queen. He was making offerings to a goddess. And it terrified Rome. Not just the scandal, but the symbolism. If Cleopatra could pull one Roman titan into her orbit, why not another? Why not them all? Alexandria became a threat not just militarily, but philosophically. A place where power didn't need to conquer, it could simply seduce. And that was more dangerous than a legion. But here's your fringe tidbit. Cleopatra reportedly hosted an entire banquet underwater. She had a glass chamber lowered into the harbor and filled it with scented air. She and Antony dined while fish darted above them, swimming through beams of filtered moonlight. Real or exaggerated, the story stuck because it felt true. Cleopatra didn't need to perform miracles. She just needed people to believe she could. And now, as the sun sets on Alexandria, you sit in the shadow of two entwined lovers who are becoming something more than a couple. They're becoming a symbol, a terrifying, tantalizing new political creature that Rome can't define and certainly can't control. Antony, once feared for his brutality, is now feared for his devotion. Cleopatra, once dismissed as a regional monarch, is now the axis around which Roman futures are spinning. So you lean back, wine on your tongue, and wonder not whether this will end in fire, but how long before it does. The night explodes in cymbals and drumbeats, and you're suddenly aboard a floating pleasure palace, Antony's worship, though tonight it's masquerading as a Dionysian fever dream. The sails glow with torchlight, the planks are slick with oil and wine, and around you, dancers swirl in loops of silk while musicians pound rhythms that feel like heartbeat and thunder at once. You're not at sea, you're in orbit. And at the center, like gravity in perfume form, is Cleopatra. Tonight, she's not Isis, not Aphrodite. She's herself, barefoot, laughing, wrapped in translucent linen that catches the wind like a secret. Across the table, Antony looks like a man who knows he should be leading a campaign, but forgot what campaign means. You've never seen anything quite like it. And neither had the Romans, because this isn't a love story, it's a state ritual. Every goblet poured, every slow-motion kiss, every song played on double-reed flute is another brick in a political cathedral. Cleopatra is building from sensuality and spectacle. This is where governance and seduction overlap so seamlessly you can't tell if the generals are moaning from pleasure or surrender. The feasts are daily. Lavish doesn't even begin to cover it. Cleopatra once ordered a dinner where each course featured animals never seen by Roman eyes. Ostrich eggs, grilled. Lion heart, honey-roasted giraffe tongue. She claimed to be feeding the gods, but everyone knew the gods were seated at the table. Another night, they staged a play where Antony played Hercules and Cleopatra, a priestess who anointed him with oils only her handmaidens could prepare, oils laced with psychoactive herbs that made Antony laugh, cry, and swear eternal loyalty between courses. And here's your mandatory sex story. In the Kama Sutra, it suggested that lovers gain power over one another by staging mock battles with physical penalties. Loser submits. Winner names the next position. Cleopatra took this idea and turned it into court policy. According to some papyri fragments, she and Antony invented night games where foreign dignitaries were invited to watch scripted contests between the two games that blurred the line between theater, foreplay, and policy meeting. These diplomatic performances or personal rituals? Historians still argue whether the performances had legal implications or were just another form of pleasure-drenched propaganda. But don't be fooled by the wine and tambourines. Every celebration was a smokescreen. Still, scented, and certain that history would find her irresistible. While Antony sipped date wine and called himself the new Dionysus, Cleopatra was consolidating power. She was placing family members in priesthoods, drafting treaties with Eastern monarchs, and carefully assigning lands to her children. Even their twins Helios and Selene were part of the strategy, named after the sun and moon, to symbolize the couple's claim to universal sovereignty. If Rome represented rational conquest, Cleopatra offered celestial inevitability. Still, Cleopatra understood the risk. Excess can intoxicate, but it also incites envy, so she controlled the optics. Reports sent back to Rome painted Alexandria as a land of sex cults, mindless hedonism, and foreign corruption. What they missed, what they refused to see, was the infrastructure beneath the ecstasy. Cleopatra was choreographing loyalty through indulgence. Her palace functioned as a well-oiled theater of allegiance, where guests pledged fealty while half-naked acrobats twirled above their heads. And Antony? He surrendered more than military power. He surrendered cultural identity. He started speaking Egyptian in private. He wore Eastern robes in public. His Roman officers grew uncomfortable, unsure whether their general was becoming a god or just losing his grip. Some of them defected. Others stayed because leaving meant admitting they'd also fallen under the spell. Here's your quirky tidbit. Cleopatra's court had a designated smell master. This man's entire job was scent layering, mapping the palace with sequences of aromas to provoke specific moods. In the war room, cinnamon and cedar. In the banquet hall, rose, musk, and a dash of opium. In the bedroom wing, ambergris and lotus, a combination said to slow the heartbeat and dilate the pupils. Cleopatra didn't just seduce the body. She colonized the senses. And now you watch as Antony, eyes glassy and flushed, stands to give a toast. He lifts his cup and declares Alexandria the heart of the new world. His voice cracks. Cleopatra presses a hand to his chest and whispers something you can't hear, but you feel it in your gut. It's not just about love. It's about legacy. She's asking him to imagine a future where Rome is peripheral, where they are the axis. Out the ship rocks gently, more from the weight of implication than waves. Around you, the laughter softens. Eyes turn toward the couple, not just with admiration, but with awe. You realize now, this is how history changes, not in battlefields or marble halls, But in moments like this, a queen, a general, a shared illusion too beautiful to question. And beneath it all, Cleopatra watches. Always watching. Always calculating. Because power, like perfume, lingers longest on the skin. The first thing you notice this morning is silence, not peace, but the heavy kind that smells like whetstone and unfinished arguments. The banquets are still happening, the musicians still plucking away in the colonnades, but something under the surface has shifted. You feel it in the way the guards glance sideways, in how Cleopatra walks with her chin a little higher, her steps just a touch more deliberate. Mark Antony is starting to feel the weight of being worshipped. And worship, as it turns out, can be a kind of leash. Because somewhere in the distance, Rome is fuming. Octavian Caesar's posthumously adopted son, and Antony's inconvenient. Revel is leaking letters, whispering slander, and crafting a public image of Cleopatra that drips with fear and misogyny. She's no longer just a queen. She's a threat in eyeliner. But Cleopatra? She doesn't flinch. She doubles down. In a move that makes Roman senators choke on their garum sauce, she holds a ceremony where she and Antony sit side by side on thrones of hammered gold and announce their children as rulers of various regions: Armenia, Media, Cyrenaica, Syria. Tiny toddlers crowned in silk, handed titles like King of Kings. It's more than a flex, it's a declaration. Cleopatra isn't just building a family. She's founding a dynasty. Historians still argue whether Antony truly believed in this Eastern monarchy fantasy, or whether he was simply in too deep to climb out. Either way, the damage was done. In the Roman mind, Antony had stopped being Roman. He was now something else entirely. A puppet, a heretic, a man led by lust and drowned in luxury. Octavian, ever the opportunist, seized the narrative. He published what he claimed were Antony's personal letters, love poems, erotic exchanges, even declarations of war scribbled in a lover's handwriting. Whether or not they were real didn't matter. The public believed. Rome was losing its hero to a snake-haired sorceress, and Cleopatra? She watched the fallout from a scented bath. Literally, she began holding state discussions from her bathing chamber surrounded by incense, rose water, and her ever-watchful eunuchs. There's something terrifyingly powerful about a woman who negotiates in the nude. She knew it too. She understood that intimacy is disarming. While Rome screamed of corruption and decadence, she built herself a sanctuary where politics, ritual, and pleasure blurred like steam on a polished mirror. Now let's slip in this section's necessary sex story. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman recounts Catherine the Great's obsession with sexual politics, how she'd gift her lovers estates and titles, ensuring loyalty with every kiss. Cleopatra was leagues ahead. She didn't just reward affection. She tied it to empire. Antony's access to her bed came with ports, grain shipments, and garrisons. Their lovemaking wasn't romantic retreat, it was literal foreign policy. And she made sure every night together translated into mourning treaties. Here's your fringe detail. Cleopatra owned a private astrology chamber where every guest's birth chart was recorded before they met her. She believed and had advisors who swore that knowing a man's moon placement gave her leverage in negotiations. There's even a legend that she once postponed a military decision because Mars had entered retrograde. Imagine telling your army to stand down because Venus is pouting. Cleopatra didn't just use astrology as superstition. She used it as psychological warfare. And it worked. But tonight, back in the palace, the atmosphere is tense. Antony is drunk, not joyful Dionysian drunk, but brittle, pacing, angry drunk. He shouts about betrayal, Octavian, loyalty, destiny. Cleopatra listens, silent. She's seen this version of him before. And still, she stays close, not coddling, calculating. She wraps him in perfumed linen and whispers myths into his ear until the rage dies down. She doesn't argue. she recontextualizes. Every outburst becomes a heroic omen. Every doubt is reframed as prophecy. Because the truth is, the love story is now a chess match. Cleopatra needs Antony. Not just his body, or his name, or his fleet's butt. His narrative. The world still sees him as Caesar's heir. If she can anchor herself to his legacy, she transcends queenhood. She becomes myth, but Antony, he's breaking. Every letter from Rome chips away at his confidence. Every defection, every whisper in the corridors. He knows what Octavian is doing. He knows the propaganda is working. And yet, every night he returns to Cleopatra's bed like a ship returning to its storm. And in that bed, diplomacy continues. Quiet, intentional. She reminds him of their children, their empire in the making. She kisses his scars and calls them divine maps. She speaks of gods and stars and rivers yet to be claimed. Antony falls asleep with her words in his mouth. Outside, Alexandria hums with tension. The harbor is full of ships. The streets teem with gossip. Rome is gathering its swords. And somewhere in the darkness, Cleopatra smiles. Because she knows what most rulers forget. War starts in the mind. And hers is already a battlefield others enter unarmed. You blink and suddenly you're in a Roman bathhouse, but it's not the clean marble fantasy you might imagine. It's crowded, sweaty, thick with steam and the clatter of gossip. Naked senators are lounging in pools, scratching themselves, arguing about military budgets while slaves scrub their backs with pumice stones. And the name on every chapped Roman lip is Cleopatra. Not Caesar, not Antony. Her. You hear one man mutter she bathes in milk and blood, that she speaks 7 languages and dreams in Greek, that she can bring a man to climax with a glance. You hear another say she has venom in her lipstick. They're half mocking, half horrified, but mostly obsessed. Cleopatra has become the most talked about woman in Rome without setting foot in it. That's power. That's marketing. That's erotic diplomacy gone global. This isn't about what she's doing anymore. It's about what men think she might do. Octavian weaponizes that perfectly. In his speeches, he describes Antony as no longer Roman, claims he wears eyeliner, and drinks his wine like a eunuch. He paints Alexandria as a perverse playground, a place where masculinity goes to die in scented sheets. But here's the trick: Octavian isn't worried about Antony. He's worried about what Cleopatra represents. Not foreign invasion, not magic, but inversion. A world where Rome doesn't dominate, where a woman dictates alliances through desire, where sex becomes statcraft and softness becomes strategy. And this is where it gets messy. Because Rome, for all its brawny statues and battlefield myths, has always had deep insecurities about its own manhood. From the early Republic on, Roman masculinity was performance art, stern faces, rigid discipline, public piety. But beneath the surface, a panic about softness, about losing control. Cleopatra didn't just challenge their borders. She challenged their bodies. And when Roman men pictured Antony in Cleopatra's bed, they didn't see a war hero. They saw surrender. That's why the Senate didn't just label Antony a traitor. They labeled him a degenerate. They passed decrees accusing him of abandoning Roman customs. They said he danced in golden robes, allowed servants to call him Lord of the East, and worst of all, took orders from a woman during military planning sessions. Were these claims exaggerated? Absolutely. Were they effective? Devastatingly. Let's jump to your sex story. In Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, he describes how power in ancient regimes often flowed not through violence, but through the regulation of bodies. Who could touch whom, who could speak during intimacy, who controlled the space between breaths. Cleopatra understood this instinctively. She didn't just dominate politically, she redefined how pleasure was distributed. In her court, sex wasn't a private act. It was a symbolic language, a performance that reshaped loyalty, identity, hierarchy. Antony wasn't corrupted. He was reprogrammed. And Rome hated that. Because it meant their strongest man had been turned, not by swords or sorcery, but by silk. They feared Cleopatra not as a woman, but as an idea, that the center of power could be softness, that domination could wear perfume. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Roman men believed that too much sex weakened military focus. So some generals wore tiny amulets around their waists to trap seamen and preserve discipline. Imagine that a grown man marching into battle with a magic nut catcher tucked under his armor. And they thought Cleopatra was the ridiculous one. But back in Alexandria, Cleopatra is playing the long game. She's not fazed by the insults. She knows Rome is posturing. She knows they're afraid. Antony, however, is more fragile. He reads the accusations. He paces. He drinks too much wine. He tries to host military exercises but forgets the commands. Halfway through, Cleopatra sees this. She doesn't scold. She recalibrates. She begins crafting a new identity for him, not a Roman general, but an Eastern king. She stages rituals where Antony wears crowns instead of helmets, where he gives public blessings instead of battle speeches, where his hands are kissed, not shaken. And slowly, Antony adjusts. He leans into the role. His posture shifts. He stops shaving. He starts quoting Egyptian proverbs in Greek. You realize now, Cleopatra isn't pulling him away from Rome. She's offering him something else. A life where he's not in Caesar's shadow. A new empire, built in their own image. And it's working. Not on Rome, no. They're sharpening knives. But on Antony? Absolutely. He begins to see Octavian as a fraud, a pale imitation of greatness. He tells his advisors that Cleopatra is the only one who ever understood him. You might scoff, but think about it. What does it mean to be powerful and misunderstood? To conquer a dozen cities but still feel hollow? Cleopatra fills that hollow with incense and meaning. So now, as Rome trembles with outrage and Alexandria shimmers with myth, you stand at the edge of a new conflict. One that won't be decided in temples or bedrooms anymore, but in blood. The bedroom Cold War is ending. The ships are being prepared. The lovers have chosen their side. And once again, history prepares to punish the woman who dared to change the rules. You hear it before you see it. The low shuffle of sandals over mosaic tile. The whispered clinks of bracelets against bronze doors. The hushed breath of courtiers, trained to speak in tones so soft they could lull a falcon. You're inside Cleopatra's inner circle now, not as a guest, but as a shadow, slipping between rooms where the queen's real empire breathes. You thought the throne room was the seat of power? That's just the stage. The real control sits here, behind curtains stitched with golden beetle wings, among people you've never heard of, whose names will never be carved into marble, but whose whispers could start or stop a war. Welcome to the Alexandria Mafia. It begins with Apollodorus, her bodyguard and occasional smuggler of queens in rugs. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, maps change. Then there's Charmian and Iris, her two closest handmaidens, who handle messages, poisons, wardrobe, and rumors with equal finesse. They are the gatekeepers of the queen's physical and political body. But the strangest figure is Pothinus Not, the old regent from her early reign, but a eunuch archivist trained in Persian intelligence methods. He oversees a scroll library so secret it doesn't officially exist. Every ambassador's taste in wine, noted. Every general's mistress, filed. Cleopatra doesn't read minds. She hires people who do. This is your hook. Imagine a world where every pillow carries secrets, where a slip of silk might be sewn with a listening charm, where a servant girl can recite 3 months of your dinner conversation back to her queen. In perfect cadence. That's the world Cleopatra built. Not just seduction and theater. Surveillance. And you realize now she doesn't win because she's beautiful. She wins because she knows more about you than you know about yourself. In this world, intelligence is sensual. Cleopatra makes information feel like gossip, makes threats sound like compliments. She doesn't torture, she invites. A Roman envoy disappears for 2 days and returns dazed, claiming he never even saw the queen, but now insists she supports Octavian. When asked what changed his mind, he stares into space and mutters something about a flute player and a dream. And then there's the sex story, this one about Abbas the Great of Persia, who kept a harem not for pleasure, but for control. According to the erotic spirit through history, each lover was ranked by loyalty, not beauty, and rotated strategically to manage morale and alliances. Cleopatra borrowed this principle, flipping it. She didn't keep a harem. She became one, the one offering herself as the final reward in a labyrinth of loyalty tests. Antony passed. Most didn't, but the Alexandria Mafia didn't just traffic in pleasure and paranoia. It worked like a soft-court intelligence agency. Cleopatra's inner circle managed correspondence with Indian merchants, Ethiopian warlords, and Gallic chieftains, all while keeping Antony blissfully unaware that half the food he ate came from provinces she technically didn't control. That's not seduction. That's logistical domination. Here's your fringe tidbit. Cleopatra's chambers were reportedly designed acoustically to amplify whispers from one end of the room to the other. If you stood in the right spot, you could hear someone breathing. Behind a tapestry 20 feet away, architecture as espionage. No bugging devices needed. Just good ears and better marble. And what of the queen herself in all this? She moves through the corridors like someone who already knows how it ends. Not fatalistic, but precise. She wears her hair differently each week, not for fashion, but as signals to her advisors. Braids to signal strategy mode. Loose curls when courting foreign favor. Even her earrings change based on mood and message. You'd miss all of this unless you knew the code. But everyone in her circle knows the code. Antony doesn't, of course, he's the fire. Cleopatra is the oil lamp. She contains him, fuels. Him lets him burn only where useful. While he rages against Octavian's latest insult, she's already instructed Charmian to send gold to 3 Syrian tribal leaders who will pivot the war eastward. Antony thinks he's steering the ship, but Cleopatra built the harbor. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's intelligence network rivaled Rome's, but when Rome finally invaded, their generals were shocked to discover she knew the landing schedule before the ships even sailed. That's not magic, that's infrastructure. Built by women, eunuchs, exiles, and spies. And that's the twist no one talks about. Behind the seductions, the golden sails, the pearl wine theatrics, Cleopatra's most powerful weapon wasn't her beauty, it was her bureaucracy. Her ability to turn intimacy into loyalty, loyalty into intelligence, intelligence into policy. She ruled through the body, yes, but she governed through systems. So now, as you sit on the edge of her inner sanctum, watching a young scribe quietly light a scroll with the day's secrets, you understand why Rome was right to fear her. Not because she corrupted their men, but because she built something they never coulda. Kingdom where surveillance smells like jasmine and resistance sleeps between satin sheets. It doesn't feel like a battle, not at first. It feels like a dinner party gone sour. Like a curtain that won't fall after the final act. The sea outside Actium is too calm for what's coming, and you can taste something metallic in the air like blood that hasn't been spilled yet. The sails are up, the war drums are silent, and on the quarterdeck of the largest ship Cleopatra has ever financed, she stands barefoot, staring into the wind as if it owes her an apology. This isn't how it was supposed to end. Not with sails and panic, not with silence from Antony's generals, not with Rome laughing in the background. Here's your hook. Imagine building an empire on love, on beauty, on cunning, on rituals older than the marble columns in the Forum, and then watching It all unraveled because one man lost his nerve. That's the heartbreak of Actium, not the naval defeat. Not the politics. It's Antony, shattered, breathless, his old soldier's reflexes drowned in wine and memory. Cleopatra doesn't run. Not yet. She waits. And when he comes to her, staggering, asking what they should do, she doesn't scream. She simply nods. That's the signal. The escape route has been lit. The ship's turn. Her fleet breaks formation first. Not because she's betraying him, but because she's preserving something. A future. A son. A final breath of the legacy she's built. And Antony, watching her sails fade into the horizon, does something Rome would never forgive. He follows. He leaves the battle. Leaves his men. Leaves his pride floating like wreckage on the wine-dark sea. They say he was bewitched. That Cleopatra must have drugged him, drained his honor, chained his heart to hers with some erotic voodoo only foreign women know. But you were there. You saw him hesitate. Saw him choose her. He wasn't weak. He was just done. And that's the tragedy of it. Antony, once the hammer of Rome, the lion of the East, the man who rode into cities like thunder reduced. Now to a lover clinging to a woman's legacy like driftwood. Cleopatra doesn't blame him, not out loud. But you can feel it when they speak. Fewer shared jokes, more silence. Her kisses are softer now, not tender measured. She's calculating. The next move while he mourns the last, they retreat to Alexandria. Not in disgrace, but in disguise. The city welcomes them with incense and parades, pretending the war was just a misunderstanding. Cleopatra re-enters her palace like a priestess returning from a vision quest. But the court knows. The children know. The music doesn't last as long. The wine is poured more carefully. And in the silence, Rome sharpens its teeth. Here's your required sex story. From Eleanor Hermann's Sex with Kings comes the tale of Queen Christina of Sweden, who, after abdicating her throne, tried to seduce her way back into power by staging provocative salons and rebranding herself as a divine muse. It failed. The people had already moved on. Cleopatra knows this pattern. Knows that once you lose the narrative, you either reinvent it or die with it. So she starts rehearsing both options. She builds a mausoleum, not a tomb, a monument. A place where her body will outlast her failures. It's said she supervised. Every stone, chose the scents to be burned there, selected the music to be played when the time came. This isn't grief, this is choreography. Cleopatra is staging her own ending like it's just another performance. And Antony? He drifts, he trains, he drinks, he tries to rebuild his army, but his soldiers are tired of his love story. They want Rome, they want Octavian, they want a future. And Cleopatra, still watching, still calculating, begins to realize something devastating. Antony is no longer her asset. He's her liability. They have one final moment. One night where they drink like they used to, when he calls her my queen, and she lets herself believe it. The next morning, Rome breaches the harbor. It's over before it starts. Antony is told Cleopatra is dead. He believes it instantly. He falls on his own sword, collapsing beside a servant who never got his name right. He doesn't die right away. Cleopatra is brought to him. She cradles his body. And for once, she doesn't speak in metaphors. She says, "It's not well with me." Here's your fringe tidbit. Some sources claim Cleopatra kept a small vial of venom sewn into the hem of her sleeve, replaced monthly, tested on pigeons, and guarded by a eunuch with no tongue. Not because she was morbid, but because she knew better than most how quickly loyalty could turn to legend. And so you walk with her now, slowly, as she ascends the steps of her tomb. Perfumed, painted, poised, she leaves instructions. She selects the linens. She watches as the Roman guards approach. And in her final act, Cleopatra becomes what Rome could never kill: a myth. A woman who made kings crawl and empires ache, not with armies, but with intention. You don't hear the silence that follows Cleopatra's death. You feel it. It creeps in through the limestone walls, wraps around the columns like ivy, settles into the pulse of Alexandria until even the birds seem to hush mid-flight. The queen is gone, and the world holds its breath, unsure whether to mourn, to fear, or to rewrite. You sit in the tomb, barely lit by oil lamps still flickering with the scent of lotus and ash. Her body lies beside Antony's, wrapped, perfumed. Perfectly staged. No chaos, no tears. Cleopatra didn't die in exile. She died in control. That's what people forget. That even in death, she curated her legend down to the pose of her fingers. And Octavian? The boy who had chased her shadow across continents finally arrives to find the curtain already down. He wanted to parade her through Rome in chains. But she left him with a corpse, a memory, and a mystery sealed in a snakebite. Or maybe poison. Or maybe something else. Historians still argue whether she died by asp, blade, or a cleverly dosed cocktail slipped into a hairpin. But that's the point. Cleopatra didn't just evade capture, she evaded certainty. She made her death just as political as her life. Here's your hook. Imagine an empire so threatened by a woman's mind, it had to erase her body. Octavian wastes no time. He orders all statues rededicated, scrolls burned, coins melted down, and reminted without her face. Cleopatra's children with Antony are split and scattered. The twins are raised in Rome, renamed, stripped of titles. Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, the boy who could claim 2 worlds, is quietly executed. Too dangerous to live. Too symbolic to parade, and yet, the myth lingers, because Cleopatra didn't just leave behind silk and stories. She left echoes. You hear them in later queens who would weaponize beauty and diplomacy. Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth I, even Hollywood's endless parade of Cleopatra rewrites, each one a little less accurate, but none less fascinated. Rome wanted her forgotten. Instead, it made her immortal. Here's your final sex story. In the Byzantine courts, it was said that Empress Theodora would bathe in saffron before negotiations, believing the scent softened her enemy's resolve. Cleopatra had been doing that for years. She'd understood what empires always miss: that scent, texture, the glint of candlelight. These were tools, not luxuries. She could rule a man's mind by occupying his senses. And no sword could counter that dot and the quirky tidbit. Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Archaeologists have searched for decades. Some say it's beneath the sea, sunken with her secrets. Others claim it lies beneath a modern village, or hidden under temple ruins near Toposiris Magna. Maybe it will never be found. Maybe that's the point. Maybe she designed it that way, vanishing into history just enough to be eternal. So now you sit at the edge of her story, and you wonder what it meant. Was she a villain? A seductress? A sovereign clinging to relevance? Or the last queen of a vanishing age, using the only tools she had to hold off the future a little longer? Maybe all of it, maybe none of it. But one thing is certain: Cleopatra was not a side character in Rome's story. Rome was a guest appearance in hers. She loved. She ruled. She lost. But she did all of it with a level of agency that still terrifies people to this day. And that's why they keep rewriting her as a temptress, a witch, a desperate widow. Because the truth is harder to accept. She was brilliant, strategic, and emotionally fluid in a way empire rarely understands. You close your eyes now. Back in your room, the fan humming like a distant tide. You imagine the scent of myrrh, the flicker of torches on gold, the hush of the Nile at night. Cleopatra isn't gone. Not really. She's still here in stories, in symbols, in the fear that power can come wrapped in softness and silk instead of steel. And as your breathing slows, you realize something. It was never about seduction. It was about presence, the kind that lingers, the kind that teaches history to whisper instead of shout, the kind that makes even Rome's cold marble blush. Now slow your thoughts. Let your breath follow the rhythm of those ancient oars gliding through water, steady and soft. Imagine the lanterns bobbing on Cleopatra's barge as it disappears into the mist, the perfume of lily still hanging in the air. The drama is over. The lovers have fallen. But the story remains, suspended in time, like the moonlit shimmer on the Nile. You're safe. You're still. And though history may be restless, tonight you are not. End of script. Sweet dreams.